Mr. Principal and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to participate in the 1993 Hayward Lectures. I wish to preface any comments that I may have concerning my own perspective on faith with some words of appreciation of the late Constance Irene Hayward, Acadia graduate, citizen of the world, generous benefactor of many causes, and a charming personal friend. Chester Clark Hayward, Constance's father, in whose memory the Hayward Lectures were established, was a leading citizen, businessman, and churchman in Moncton, New Brunswick. When he died in January 1955, his widow, Adelina, moved to Wolfville. Constance retired from federal government service in 1958 and came to take up residence with her mother. On the 11th of December 1964, Mrs. Hayward wrote to Dr. J.R.C. Beveridge, Acadia University president, offering a substantial endowment for an annual lectureship in theology and related subjects. The following year, the first Hayward Lectures were delivered by Dr. Roger Hazelton, Professor of Christian Theology at Andover Newton Theological School. The material was expanded and subsequently appeared in a book entitled A Theological Approach to Art. That was 1967. And since that time, the lectures have been offered each year and are considered among the university's most prestigious public presentations. Now, while the lectures were in memory of her father and the endowment provided by her mother, the basic concept and its elaboration were the work of Constance Hayward. She graduated from Acadia in 1927, studied at the Ontario College of Education, and taught for 3 years. She then studied for 2 years at the London School of Economics, specializing in international relations. From 1938 to 48, she was secretary of the Canadian National Committee on Refugees, and for a further decade was a senior official in the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. Perhaps Miss Hayward's most remarkable contribution to Canada was made between 1941 and 1943, when she was instrumental in rectifying a serious and complicated injustice. In the years immediately prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, many German intellectuals fled to Britain. In 1940, the British government interned many of these immigrants, classified them as dangerous aliens, and persuaded Canada to take and imprison them. The people in the group ranged in age from 15 to 60. Many had been leading musicians, scientists, and literary men in Germany before they fled to escape the policies of the Nazis. It was Constance Hayward and Senator Karine Wilson who resolved to clear up the muddle concerning the true nature of the so-called dangerous aliens. They finally succeeded, and the prisoners were released. Many of them promptly joined the Canadian Armed Forces, and others offered their services to universities and other institutions and organizations throughout the country. The story was not fully told until 1980, at which time Eric Koch's book, Deemed Suspect, appeared. Valerie Knowles' biography of Senator Karine Wilson, this was 1988, entitled First Person, also recounts in detail the steps taken to convince the Canadian government that a major mistake had been made. At Acadia, the Art Gallery, the French Residence, and the Departments of Comparative Religion and History benefited from Constance Hayward's generosity. She strongly supported international studies and was an articulate advocate of women's issues. The Hayward Medal for Outstanding Performance in the Faculty of Arts is a fitting acknowledgement of her academic interest, and the development of Alumni Hall from the former President's residence again bears testimony to her vision and generosity. Miss Hayward was a governor of the university from 1969 until her death in 1982. And during those years I was in frequent contact with her and am pleased to have this opportunity to make public recognition of her tremendous gifts of mind and spirit. It's 150 years since Acadia conferred its first degrees. The recipients were John Leander Bishop, Lewis Johnston, and Amos Sharp, all of whom became physicians, and James William Johnston, who became a lawyer and judge, and in 1860 was chosen as the first president of the Associated Alumni. It's 25 years since Acadia Divinity College formally came into being, an event which is being marked in many imaginative ways. It's 28 years since the first Hayward lecture was delivered, this then being the 29th, and yesterday the university installed its 13th president. I include those brief historical comments because they may remind us how much the world and the university has changed since the first students, 21 in all, went to class on the 21st of January 1839. I am pleased that the title of this year's Hayward Lectures reflects, or at least gives us the opportunity to reflect, the profound changes of the last 154 years. Speakers were invited to address the theme, Perspectives on Faith. The title is not Perspectives on the Faith, implying the existence of one definitive set of religious beliefs. The theme is generic and reminds us, I believe intentionally, that most universities, including Acadia, are pluralistic institutions. My title is Perspectives on Faith from the President's Office. And a comment on the methodology to be used and a couple of working definitions may be helpful. The methodology of preparation was really very simple. I asked myself what were the major faith-related issues with which I struggled during 12 years in the President's office. The term faith is, of course, susceptible to many legitimate definitions. I shall use it to mean a commitment to certain principles leading to conduct guided by the values those principles imply. The term morality, to which major reference will be made, is used in a broad, descriptive sense to mean observed patterns of behavior in individuals or groups. Before I can discuss the two key faith-related issues which challenged my thinking, it is necessary to describe the significant changes which have taken place in the nature and exercise of authority within the university during the last quarter of a century, and also to elaborate the concept of pluralism as it exists in contemporary Canadian society. So first, let's take a look at this matter of authority. Since the 1960s, the nature of presidential authority in Canadian universities has undergone a radical change. Despite much current talk about the good old days which used to exist before faculty unionization began to sweep the country, and despite widespread belief that there was a great deal of collegiality 25 or 30 years ago, the fact is that in those days the President had a large measure of real, direct authority. His, and in those days it was almost invariably his, role in such matters as appointments, promotion, granting of tenure, salary awards, and occasional dismissals was a crucial one. There were few, if any, faculty members on boards of governors, and certainly none on executive committees. The complex procedures used today for the selection of senior administrators and others had not yet been thought of, much less written and implemented. The President's role in relation to academic issues such as admissions, curriculum, examinations and graduations was also direct and of major significance. There were committees in these areas, but they did not have the formative influence possessed by their contemporary counterparts. The President also wielded a great deal of authority in areas now designated student services. He decided what was acceptable behaviour, who had met the required standards, and the fate of those who fell short. The annals of Acadia student life contain a delightful anecdote which illustrates the nature of presidential authority in a bygone era. In December 1918, Ralph Wetmore, who was later to become a distinguished professor of botany at Harvard University, arrived by train in Wolfville to begin his first year at Acadia. He had just been demobilized after service with the Canadian Army and was eagerly awaiting his first experience of university life. As he alighted from the train in Wolfville, he heard the stirring sounds of a brass band coming from a group of young men assembled on the platform. He thought it was a nice touch for the university to arrange such an appropriate welcome for a new student freshly arrived from the trenches. However, it quickly transpired that the band was not playing in Welcome to Wetmore, but in farewell to a group of students about to board the train. They had been summarily suspended by President Cutton for misbehavior and were on their way home for the rest of the year. It is often alleged that universities now employ more administrators in proportion to their size than used to be the case. In many instances this is true, but one may also point out that the decision-making process is now more complex than it used to be, involves more groups, and most career-related decisions are subject to appeal. Decisions and recommendations which used to be made or forwarded to the board by the President after some usually informal consultation must now be meticulously channeled through a complex process. In fact, in many quite serious issues, the question of whether due process has been followed becomes as important as the substantive matter to be decided. Much of the change is tersely summed up in the 1990 Carnegie Foundation special report entitled Campus Life in Search of Community. In the foreword, Ernest Boyer describes the student protests of the 1960s and notes that the fundamental question students asked was, by what authority can the university arbitrarily regulate our lives? Note, the question does not challenge the content of administrative decisions, but the right of the administration to make any decisions affecting students. The report advocates the renewal of universities by the process of making the institutions more purposeful, open, just, disciplined, caring, and celebrative communities. These are noble characteristics, certainly ones to be sought and promoted by the President. But such promotion must be undertaken with due consideration for all the many interested parties. The Carnegie report is unequivocal in its statement of the role of the President in building community. I quote a paragraph from it. Building community in higher education calls for leadership at the highest level. The President sets the tone of the institution and in large measure determines the priorities to be pursued. The President, as Chief Administrator, is engaged in the day-to-day details of management, but the task of the President as leader is to transcend details, present a larger, more inspired vision, and remind the community of those essential qualities that guide the institution. I said there were two matters of context. One was presidential authority. We come now to the other, which is pluralism. The change in the type of authority which can be exercised by a university president is paralleled by another change, the one whereby former church-controlled institutions are becoming pluralist communities. We are probably all aware of the surprisingly comprehensive language of Section 8 of the 1840 Act for incorporating the trustees of the Queen's College at Horton. The section deserves to be quoted in full, although I'm well aware that many here know it almost off by heart. And be it further enacted that no religious tests or subscriptions shall be required of the professors, fellows, scholars, graduate students, or officers of the said college, but that all the privileges and advantages thereof shall be open and free to all and every person and persons whomsoever, without regard to religious persuasion, and that it shall and may be lawful for the trustees and governors of the said college to select as professors and other teachers or officers competent persons of any religious persuasion whatever, provided such person or persons shall be of moral and religious character. The background to this remarkable provision was the refusal, apparently on religious grounds, of another university to hire Edmund Alban Crawley as a professor. The founders of Queen's College, as Acadia was then being called, were determined that such discrimination would not be practiced here. The really intriguing question, of course, is whether our founders were resolved to outlaw denominational discrimination, or whether they chose the word religious deliberately and envisaged a time when adherents of faiths other than Christianity would be members of the university community. In 1966, the Baptist Convention, which to that point had been legally responsible for the university, relinquished its control. The process Acadia subsequently underwent is usually referred to as secularization, by which is meant that final authority passed from a spiritual to a temporal body, from a church organization to a board of governors. The use of this term, secularization, while the correct one, may lead to misunderstanding, because, I hope you'll forgive me if I have this rather abstruse phrase in here, the result of secularization is not necessarily a secular institution. In the case of Acadia, as in the case of every other Canadian ecclesiastical institution which was secularized, the result was not a secular, but a pluralist university. A truly secular university would be one in which no religious practices were recognized or even allowed. A pluralist university is one in which any legal form of religious practice is allowed or even recognized. Now, I believe that Acadia is still attempting to come to terms with this understanding of pluralism. There are those who still regard the university as a Baptist school, as though Bill 49 of 1966 had never been passed by the Provincial House of Assembly. At the other extreme are those who seem to think that secularization has severed the present institution from its historic roots, and that any formal recognition of the religious tradition is somehow improper. Among the other positions which have been adopted is one which would severely limit the extent to which Christianity may find expression on campus, while cheerfully welcoming a wide variety of non-Christian beliefs and practices. The context in which the president works requires that he or she not only recognize the pluralist nature of the university, but actively promote that characteristic and protect the freedom of the various groups that make up the religious spectrum, including those who do not subscribe to any religious creed at all. It's easy to state that philosophical position. It is more difficult to implement it, especially in a world where militant fundamentalism of many kinds is a reality, and where there exist many religious organizations, the legality of whose activities may be seriously questioned, and in a country where privacy is honored in word, but frequently invaded in practice. In summary, The incumbent of the presidential office possesses very little direct executive authority and serves in a context of emergent pluralism. In my case, this changed context meant that I had to deal with two issues which to that point had been for me interesting, abstract, philosophical topics, but now became issues on which it was essential that I have a position which could be described and defended on the campus and in the community. The first issue is that of personal and institutional morality. If it is defensible to assert that the President, regardless of his or her religious convictions or decision not to have any religious convictions, is a guardian of pluralism, it presupposes a distinction of major significance, namely the distinction between personal and institutional morality. If we take seriously the right of the President to have personal religious convictions, or equally the right not to have any such convictions, while at the same time we assert the pluralist nature of the university, which is also aware of its religious roots, then we must recognize at least the possibility that the President's views and the prevailing institutional ethos may not be the same. Public expectation of senior officials, whether in government, health or education, tends to be uncomfortable with this distinction. If an official is appointed who publicly endorses an orthodox Christian creed, there tends to be the expectation that he or she will now use the administrative structure to promote Christian beliefs and practices, regardless of whether such promotion would be proper. Conversely, the appointment of an individual of no professed religious faith is often greeted with dismay by religious communities, despite the fact that the appointee may have a profound and meticulous understanding of pluralism. I have used the phrase personal and institutional morality because in the popular conception the emphasis falls on the question of actions rather than beliefs. We don't mind what people believe, it's when they start putting those things into action we get worried. Will the Minister of Health try to prohibit abortions? Will the President try to close the chapel or attempt to make chapel attendance compulsory? Will the person responsible for student services encourage or forbid the sale of contraceptives on campus? The crucial point is whether the person in a key position is able to distinguish between his or her personal views and what may be best for the community as a whole, the community for which he or she is responsible. It's time to illustrate this important and perhaps difficult distinction. I will do so from a personal standpoint. As an individual, I believe that prayer is helpful, and however busy a day was, I formed the habit of saying a brief prayer in the morning, during the lunch break, and in the evening. I believe that others might find such a practice of value. That is part of a personal conviction, the expression of a personal faith in certain actions. From the point of view of an observer, the practice of prayer may be seen as part of personal morality. But the university is a pluralist community. It would therefore be quite improper for the President to try to insist that everyone attend chapel, or say prayers, or adopt some other outward form of religious commitment. The President must safeguard the pluralist nature of the university. Equally, although this is much more or much less frequently recognized, the university must be willing to safeguard the President's freedom to engage in or refrain from personal religious expression. Let me take another illustration, more controversial if you like. the question of the sale of contraceptives on a university campus. Personally, I am uneasy with a policy which would give young people totally open access to contraceptives. Given that the availability of an item usually increases its use, free access to contraceptives might encourage irresponsible sexual behavior. However, personal presidential views must be set in the context of three major factors of which the President, as an administrator, must be acutely aware. First, the existence of serious studies which document evidence for a considerable amount of sexual activity among university students. Second, the fact that a great deal of stress and trauma is caused by unwanted pregnancies. And third, the opinion of physicians and researchers that the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases is reduced by the use of condoms. Consideration of these factors may result in a situation in which personal presidential morality would not be in favour of open access to contraceptives on the campus, but institutional morality, which the President must develop and defend, would allow such access. Let me try to sum this up in a sentence. What I'm saying is that institutional morality is not and cannot be personal morality projected onto a large screen or decided simply by a majority vote. One sad development, in my opinion, in Western politics has been the practice of holding free votes in parliaments when decisions on highly controversial social legislation are being made. It sounds very noble when the government is able to announce that members will vote according to their consciences, but this ignores the fact that national morality should not be established by the putting together of numerous personal moralities. Rather, the members should be asking themselves what is right for the whole of society. And this may result in legislation which is different from anything that would be written by or for an individual. It's ironic that at points where initiatives in matters of social legislation become both very difficult and crucially important, governments are prone to abdicate the very leadership they were elected to exercise. One result of the fairly rapid development of pluralism in Canadian society is that a pattern of thinking which had existed since before Confederation has largely disappeared as a normative force, and this in a matter of a few decades. The Judeo-Christian tradition had provided the basis and values for Western Europe and North America for many centuries. Social customs, holidays, the principles of personal and group conduct, summed up in the Ten Commandments, provided a cohesive and homogeneous structure for society. On the cultural level, references to biblical characters and narratives formed the raw material of novels, plays, and musical presentations. Intellectually, the Judeo-Christian tradition was the cognitive framework of education from kindergarten to the highest levels. Of course, there were many who criticized that tradition and some who actively opposed it. But they all knew what it was they criticized or opposed. The philosophy of the West was partly shaped by this same tradition. There were philosophers who denounced or attacked the tradition. Rarely did they ignore it. In short, the Judeo-Christian tradition formed the commonly accepted basis of life, belief, conduct, education, and values of the Western world, and hence was a very important factor in communication. People of all walks of life were able to refer to a common stock of ideas, knowing that their contemporaries would understand what they were talking about. The situation in a pluralist society is vastly different. There is now no common stock of ideas on which all Canadians may draw. References and values which used to facilitate communication may now actually impede it, because the reference may be misunderstood and the values not shared. This has happened in the universities. One of the most frequent complaints is that there is a lack of communication among the constituent groups on the campus. And this happens not only because the different groups may well have differing interests at heart, but more importantly, because there is no common societal tradition in which we all share and from which we all inherit certain basic values. At best, there is a wide range of humanistic views, but these views are so diverse and uncoordinated that they are not adequate without further development and clarification to bear the weight of ethical decision-making in contemporary Western society. Institutional morality depends on shared values and objectives. In small institutions, the upheaval and loss of identity during the last 25 or 30 years has been less traumatic than in the very large universities. But the development of a new corporate identity is slow and difficult, even on small campuses. To develop identity, it's necessary to know one's history, to share common goals, to use institutional symbols, and to add to the number of symbolic acts which are practiced. I would argue that the development of institutional identity and morality is a key feature of the President's role and forms part of the perspectives on faith as seen from that office. Well, I tried to suggest that university presidents today have considerably less direct executive authority than did their predecessors. They also fulfill their duties in a context of emergent pluralism. This situation leads to the necessity of making a distinction between personal and institutional morality. There is one other result of the changes that have taken place. It is now essential that presidents rethink the connection between education and values. The history of education in the Western world is closely linked to the history of the Church. For centuries, the basis of literacy and scholarship was in the monasteries and a few ancient universities in which most teachers were priests or members of religious orders. One result of the Reformation was the establishment of schools and academies run by a variety of denominations and religious groups. Anglicans and nonconformists were particularly assiduous in providing education at all levels for their children and young people. In Nova Scotia, the first teachers in schools were all sponsored by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, an Anglican foundation which sent clergy educators to various parts of the world. Elementary and secondary education in this province was built on a religious tradition which expressed itself in daily prayers and knowledge of biblical narratives and denominational distinctives. That pattern began to change as successive waves of immigrants significantly altered the ethnic composition of society throughout Canada, including Nova Scotia, although here the impact was somewhat less marked than in many other parts of the country. The new Canadians brought different traditions and religious beliefs, and this introduced a new flexibility into previously homogeneous communities. While some second-generation immigrants were content to stay firmly in the faith and practice provided by their parents, others were eager to break away and exploit freedom in matters of belief and conduct. Society generally began to develop the pluralism we earlier discussed in relation to the universities. Now, one of the results of the control of schools and universities by churches and religious groups was that the students were systematically exposed to a widely held set of ethical values. These were usually based on the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule, and were not only commended to students, but also expected of them. While the version of Christian ethics that operated in many schools and colleges was not necessarily very sensitive, and sometimes enforced in an authoritarian manner, The fact is that certain patterns of conduct were expected of the whole academic community. The system may have been restrictive, and the punishment of offenders may have been more zealous than any attempt to rehabilitate them. But there were clear guidelines for conduct, and the ethical structure was supportive to those growing up within it. From the end of the Second World War, the determinative role of the Church in education was increasingly challenged, and the importance of the separation of church and state ever more vigorously was stressed. This was particularly apparent in the public school systems, where contact between teachers and students was much more direct and influential than in post-secondary institutions. So over the years, the pattern became clearer. The state would take charge of public education, would set the standards, make the rules, and practice pluralism. All taxpayers would contribute to the maintenance of a system designed for all. The churches would then be free to run separate educational enterprises, but those who chose to support them would pay twice for the education of their children. The philosophy is that public money ought not to be used to finance private schools, although in practice, of course, things are not as clear as that statement would suggest. When the control of public education by the Church lessened and then virtually disappeared altogether, the presentation of Christian values as the normative pattern of conduct was also removed. The removal was at times painful. Some people believed that any attempt to present moral values would allow Christian teaching, which had just been courteously seen off at the front door, to return by some other route. Others thought that if there were no expectation of a Christian ethic, there would be no ethical expectation at all. This would result in a kind of moral anarchy which would reign in the educational system. In 1966, the Government of Ontario decided to face the difficult question of how to present proper standards in the schools while accepting public demands for an end to what was seen as undue Christian influence in the educational system. The government appointed a committee, part of whose terms of reference was to study means by which character building, ethics, social attitudes, and moral values and principles may best be instilled in the young. Notice the qualities are to be instilled in, not commended to, the young. The committee, chaired by the Honourable J. Keeler Mackay, presented its report in 1969. Its title aptly summed the direction in which the report pointed: Religious Information and Moral Development. The first recommendation indicated how much things had changed since the 1944 provincial speech from the throne. That speech from the throne from the Drew government asserted, religious education will be offered in public and secondary schools. The response of the Mackay Committee to the legislation passed by the Drew government in 44 and 45 was as follows. We recommend that the present course of study in religious education in the elementary schools of Ontario be discontinued, and that its aims as set out in related legislation, programs of studies, regulations and guidebooks be abandoned. Another recommendation advocated a formal course of study dealing with the principal religions of the world. The controversial issue of moral development of students was dealt with in Recommendation 6. We recommend that the high duty of public education to foster character building be discharged through a clearly understood, continuously pursued, universal program, pervading every curricular and extracurricular activity in the public school system, from the beginning of elementary to the close of secondary education. This program, which is to be distinguished from a course of study, should be carefully planned and administered incidentally throughout the whole school spectrum. It will have as its focus character building, ethics, social attitudes, and moral values and principles. Now, I believe that the Mackay report faithfully reflected the prevailing opinion in Ontario that the public school system should no longer be, or be thought to be, a vehicle by which the churches continued to present Christian ethical teaching. But as is often the case, the report was less successful in its attempt to describe how the noble virtues it listed could be presented to and developed in students at all levels within the system. There followed many creative attempts to develop what came to be called values education. Most were failures for one of two reasons. Sometimes the teachers simply used the new label on the old package of Christian ethics, and sometimes teachers wanted genuinely to break new ground, but lacked the philosophical background to bring a variety of ethical issues together into one cohesive pattern. The point of this is that the students who are now in universities have, for the most part, graduated from a school system in which there is no formal instruction in moral values and, in many cases, no serious collective attempt to develop character-building personal qualities. When we turn our attention to universities, it is clear that today's graduates will enter and exercise leadership in a world full of unprecedented ethical issues. Indeed, many of these issues confront the students while they are still in course. Ethical questions, just to give a little thumbnail definition here, ethical questions arise when one seeks to identify and implement the best choice among several possible courses of action. The availability of reliable contraceptives makes student sexual conduct more a matter of choice than was the case 50 years ago. As leaders in tomorrow's society, today's students will have to deal with profound ethical questions, some of which, abortion, euthanasia, pollution, addiction, violence, may be literally life and death issues. Again, from the perspective of the President's office, it may be doubted whether universities are doing as much as they should to prepare students for the decisions that await them in the next century. They will have to decide who shall receive the organ transplant when only one is available for the 10 sufferers. Or to put this dilemma another way that has already been raised in medical fraternities, should a family have a right to decide that the body of their loved one may not be used to provide much-needed organs? Should companies be allowed to continue to pollute the land and water? Or should industries be closed with attendant loss of employment for thousands of people? How will the gap between rich and poor in Canada, a gap which has actually widened during the last decade, be closed? How much weight should be given to the deprived background of a criminal? And at what point should the individual be directly answerable for his or her own actions? Such questions mark only the edges of ethical dilemmas which are already apparent. During the next few decades there will be many more, including some of which no one has yet thought. University education, if it is to be worthy of the name, must develop and implement a curriculum in which intellectual and moral growth takes place at the same time and as part of the same process. Acadia has long insisted that what it offers to students is a comprehensive life experience. We cannot afford to perpetuate the dangerous illusion that instruction is value neutral. The goal of our activity is the development of the whole individual to meet the demands of the contemporary world. In 1865, the student should enjoy this and also be warned by it. In 1865, John Stuart Mill was elected, much against his will, to the position of rector of the University of St Andrews, Scotland. For 2 years he refused to be installed. But when the event finally took place, he soundly punished the students who had elected him by delivering a 3-hour lecture, which required 11 lines simply to summarize the scope of his discourse. In the last quarter of the address, Mill, having gone to enormous lengths to describe what universities should teach, observes, "Still, it is a very imperfect education which trains the intelligence only, but not the will. No one can dispense with an education directed expressly to the moral as well as the intellectual part of his being." Mill does not think that schools or universities can do as much to educate morally as the home and the family can do, but he nevertheless has a fine section dealing with the role of the university. He says, "The moral or religious influence which a university can exercise consists less in any express teaching than in the pervading tone of the place. Whatever it teaches, it should teach as penetrated by a sense of duty. It should present all knowledge as chiefly a means to worthiness of life, given for the double purpose of making each of us practically useful to his fellow creatures and of elevating the character of the species itself, exalting and dignifying our nature. There is nothing which spreads more contagiously from teacher to pupil than elevation of sentiment." And to come to very recent time, in 1990, students at the University of North Carolina held a large symposium on the theme, "A Question of Ethics." The sessions covered 2 weeks, were addressed by an impressive array of speakers, and attracted excellent attendance. But when the ethical problems had been identified, course content had been examined, and the goals elaborated, a single sentence emerged with almost prophetic power: "Students and others learn ethical behavior not from learning rules or facts, but from examples." You might want to take that back to the closing words of Chapter 8 of the 1840 Act of Incorporation. Let me attempt to summarize my observations to this point and then conclude this lecture. The context in which a university president works today is one in which there has been a radical change in the kind of authority he or she exercises. Canadian society has become pluralist, and hence its universities, with very few exceptions, are pluralist institutions. This changed context means that the President must be able to make and implement a distinction between personal and institutional morality, and must give leadership in encouraging the development and maintenance of worthwhile values as part of the educational tone of the campus. Once again, we must be realistic and recognize that it is easy to talk about the maintenance of worthwhile values and the elevation of the educational tone of a campus, but such tasks are demanding and may be controversial. There is no immediate consensus as to which values are worthwhile, or which tone is the right one. Moreover, as we noted earlier, the search for values will have to take place in a pluralist setting where the only common basis for action may be some very general humanistic concepts, such as the value and dignity of human life and the importance of total human development. These basic human values may provide a good starting point in the search for institutional identity and morality, but it's essential that we have some idea of the end product of our search. A shorthand way of talking about this goal or end product is to speak of our vision. Vision is a word much beloved by those who write and speak about universities, and is at the heart of a key question popular with presidential search committees. What, the candidates are usually asked, is your vision for our university. Answers vary and include reference to budgets, new construction, innovative courses, salaries, public image, scholarships and prestigious awards, and so it goes on. My vision for Acadia, which I would extend to all universities, recognises the importance of money, bricks, mortar, public image, clear procedures, excellent programs, efficient administrative structures, academic recognition, and a host of other things. But at its heart are four of those basic humanistic qualities which, in the long run, determine the nature of the group or society in which we live. Two of these qualities, or values, relate to the professional conduct of faculty, staff, and students. The other two relate to the personal attitudes of members of the campus community. The professional qualities are industry and commitment. The personal qualities are tolerance and compassion. By industry, I mean doing what we are there to do and doing it as well as we can. By commitment, I mean a degree of loyalty to the institution and to our colleagues. By tolerance, I mean a conscious acceptance of legitimate differences in people, in attitudes, and in ways of doing things. By compassion, I mean, as the word implies, the willingness to identify with others in their joys, achievements, and dreams, as well as in their pain, failures, and perplexity. Now, where these qualities are absent, no amount of money or lavish accommodation or innovative programs will ensure excellence. Where these qualities abound, the institution will be excellent, whatever material problems it may have. So happens that 11 years ago yesterday, I was installed as Acadia's 12th president. It was the 17th of October. My address was an attempt to discuss what I believed and still believe are the key features of a university. Having written the address chiefly in academic and administrative language, I felt less than satisfied with the closing section. And finally, I made use of a verse from a poem by W.H. Auden. In 1939, he was depressed by the storm clouds he saw gathering over Europe and saddened by the death of his friend, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Auden's response to the situation and his grief was a fine poem entitled In Memory of W.B. Yeats. It was a powerful work, at once gentle and incisive, grieving but optimistic. And in the last verse, Auden gives us a glimpse of a process whereby the realities of the present may be transformed and the visions of the future may be realized. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Now, healing and praising may not be viewed by all as an adequate summary of traditional religion. However, they are noble activities and worthy of inclusion in our perspectives on faith.